For those of you who were here last week, we talked about a subject that was titled Aftermarket Parts, and started off in Ephesians 6. And just a brief review, so we'll keep the same thought this morning and move on into the rest of the lesson. We started in Ephesians 6 about the tools and the parts that we need to bold on as new Christians, the things that we need to take to us, how we are when God creates us new, and how it gives us all the same things, all those stock parts that come with new Christians, and we talked about that. And then we talked about the aftermarket parts that we as Christians can take into ourselves to make us more of an example, an individual example of Him. And we use that to go into these various ideas right here, talking about, of course, Christian growth. And we talked about when God saves us that we became a new Christian, and we talked about some of the things that we termed as stock parts through various scriptures here, such as old things are now passed away, being a new creature, and a new heart in Ezekiel, and a new spirit. And in Ephesians, the new man created in righteousness and true holiness. And these things are freely given to every new Christian. The Lord plainly says He's no respecter of persons. So what He gives one, He gives the other. And He makes growth available to everybody that's interested. But unfortunately, growth comes from effort, Some never care to grow too much. They're satisfied with a little fire insurance. But others want to get closer to the Lord and feel His presence. And that's what we're talking about with these new parts. Then we talked about some of the aftermarket parts that we need to bold on to ourselves as new Christians for after birth of the new creature, growth begins. And so how can we take unto us these attributes that will help us to grow and be earthly examples of His person and pictures of His power and a noticeable different from the norm? And so we talked about one of the first things that's needed in today's world is godly fear. And we talked about a couple of things there. Talked about what godly fear actually is, about it not being fear as in a bully and a tyrant or an abuser or a dictator, not that kind of fear. But we talked about what real godly fear is, and it's an inner respect and an admiration and an appreciation of what God's done for us, and how He's changed our life, that makes us from the inside want to conform to His rules and His guidelines for our life. We talked about that. And then we wound up with just a few final comments about some of the things that we get. And of course, one of these things that we get we may not understand, but the Bible's clear about, is eternal security. And we talked about the devil knows that he's lost your soul once you give your life to Jesus, and he understands as good or better than anybody, maybe that apart from Jesus, that once you're saved, you're saved. Now, people call it different things, but regardless of what anybody calls it, the Bible's clear, and it talks about Him never losing us from His hand. We're as secure as we could ever possibly be in His promises. And the devil knows that. A lot of people don't understand eternal security, and we talked about that. But whether you understand it or not, or whether you know it or not, the devil knows it, and it's real. So, knowing he cannot get your soul, His goal is to make you as weak and ineffective as possible. And that's what he tries to do. And for he knows that your purpose as a new Christian and a new creature is to live for God and try to influence as many people as possible to the Christian way and the Christian lifestyle. That's our purpose as Christians. And we also talked about how we view this life. If we view this life as a preparation ground for eternity, then we see the importance of these things. If we see life as just an opportunity to live and move and enjoy life and all the material things of this world, then these things are nowhere near as important to us. But if we realize that the time that God's given us on this earth is simply a time to prepare for the afterlife, then we realize how important these extra things are. And that's where we made it to last week. And so with that, I'll ask you to turn to Psalms chapter 34. And it's different than Ephesians where we started from last week. But still the same subject, still the same topic of aftermarket parts. And then we talked about in closing, we talked about the fender bender and the fender mender. And we were over in Dalton the other day, and I showed Sandy that billboard, and that's exactly what it says. Fender bender, meet the fender mender. And we talked about all of us as Christians at one time in our life met the fender mender. And I don't know if your fender bender was as devastating as mine was, but I needed a fender mender really bad. And so that's where we got to. And we'll start here in Psalms 34. Just keep your Bible open. And we'll look at several different verses here with the same thought in mind of aftermarket parts. Let's look at verse 9 initially. And verse 9 says, "O fear the Lord, ye his saints, for there is no want to them that fear him." Now, remember, this aftermarket part we're talking about is godly fear in the Christian's life that dictates the way we live and how we interact with others, things of that nature. And so Psalms 34:9 just reinforces that thought. "O fear the Lord, ye his saints, for there is no want to them that fear him." Now, a lot of times we glaze over that, We'll read in our daily devotions and stuff, and we'll read that verse and not even pay a bit of attention to it. But what I want you to understand, or maybe think about a little while this morning, is this is a direct promise to the Christian. There is no want. In other words, stated differently, God promises that if you'll live for him and do right and live right and try your best to stay out of the world and exemplify him, you will go through your life with no want. Now, there may be things that you'd like to have, things like this that maybe all of us can't afford. But as far as needs and necessities, God promises right here that a Christian will have no want. We all ought to memorize that verse. And just think, has he not provided every need? The old saying is hindsight's 20/20. And we'll all agree with that. Hindsight's 20/20. Well, just look back through your life. I try to do that quite regularly. Just look back at all the storms and the problems and the troubles that he ultimately brought me out of. Now, during the midst of the storm, it was questionable in my mind a couple of times whether or not we was ever going to make it out the other side. But in looking back with all honesty, I have to say that every time He was faithful and true. And He brought us out every time. Now, if He done that every time, then the probability is that He's going to do it every time in the future. Would you not agree with that? If He's 100% back then, He's probably going to be 100% in the future. Yeah, you know, the world even agrees with that. Did you know that? The old saying, Lord, I heard this 10 million times in my work career. And you know, the world's definition of insanity, if you keep doing the same thing the same way and expecting a different outcome, they label as insanity. Lord, do have mercy, I heard that so much, it rings in my ears. But anyway, just think about that. If you do the same thing as a Christian that you did in the past, and the Lord saved you out of every one of your troubles, then even the world agrees to expect a different outcome in the future is insanity. Right? So even they would agree that if you live for the Lord, the outcome's pretty well assured each and every time. I don't know if you remember or not, but years ago, Brother Stennett Blue was here, and he preached a message that stuck with me through the years, and the title was, if I'm not mistaken, I think this is right, the title was If and Then. I don't know if any of y'all remember that, but I do. If and then. And when I look at Psalms 34, it is full of those promises, if and then. So let's look over there. And I've taken the liberties of copying this off on the computer so I could mark all of these things. If I read this right, there's at least 18 ifs and ands in this chapter, but there's at least 20 thens. The Lord always gives more than you do. And so, if you look at chapter 34, verse 1 says, His praise shall continually be in my mouth. That's an if. Number 2, verse 2 says, the humble shall hear. That's number 2. Verse 3, magnify and exalt His name together. Verse 4, sought or seek. Verse 5, look unto Him. Verse 8, trusteth in Him. Verse 9, fear the Lord. Verse 10, seek the Lord. Excuse me. Verse 11, come, hearken. Verse 12, desireth. Verse 13, keep thy tongue from evil and thy lips from speaking guile. Verse 14, depart from evil and do good, seek peace and pursue it. Verse 17, cry. Verse 18, a broken heart. And also in verse 18, a contrite spirit. Now, I didn't really know what contrite meant, but I looked it up. It's remorseful and guilty and knowing it. That's what contrite is. It's guilty and knowing you're guilty. Then I looked at the thens, and these are promises from God. If you will do this and this, then He will do this. So let's see what He promises to do if and we hold up our end of the deal. Verse 4. He heard me and He delivered me from all my fears. Verse 6. The Lord heard him and saved him. Verse 7. The angel of the Lord encampeth round about them and delivereth them. Verse 8. Blessed is the man. Verse 9, there is no want to them that fear Him. Verse 10, the very end of the verse, shall not want any good thing. Verse 15, the eyes of the Lord are upon the righteous, and His ears are open unto their cry. Verse 17, the Lord heareth and delivereth. Verse 18, the Lord is nigh unto them, and He saveth such. Verse 19, the Lord delivereth him out of them all. Verse 20, He keepeth all his bones. and not one of them is broken. Verse 22. The Lord redeemeth the soul of his servants, and none of them that trust in him shall be desolate. Now, isn't that amazing? I've read Psalms 34 many times, and I never looked at it in context of Brother Stennett's message about if and then. But when I took the time this week to sit down and go through it verse at a time, I realized just what a treasure chest of blessings Psalms 34 is. That contrite word, I want to mention one thing about that before we move on. Now, I had a general idea of what contrite meant, but after looking it up and studying on it just a little while, the part that really stuck out to me was not only being remorseful, which a contrite spirit certainly is. Now, bear in mind, this is all under the context of godly fear. But being guilty and knowing it. It's hard to be humble and contrite unless you realize that you're guilty. Now, a lot of folks, are sorry that they get caught. But being sorry that you got caught is not a life-altering event in your life. For as soon as the heat dies down just a little bit, we go right back to the old way of doing things. That's what being sorry for getting caught. But a contrite spirit, meaning we got caught and we're guilty. And everybody knows we're guilty, but we understand that we're guilty as well. And the more we understand how guilty we are, then the more he can deal with our heart. Just a quick look at Luke chapter 18, verse 9. And this to me exemplifies a contrite spirit and guilt with knowledge of the guilt. Verse 9, he spake this parable unto certain which trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others. And of course, this is the parable of the publican and the Pharisee. Two men went up into the temple to pray, the one a Pharisee, the other a publican. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself, God, I thank thee that I am not as other men. Extortioners, unjust, adulterers. Or I'll put myself, even as that bunch of Higdons down there. Lord, I'm glad I ain't like that crowd. I fast twice in the week. I give tithes of all that I possess. In verse 13, it said, and the publican, standing afar off, would not lift up so much as his eyes to heaven, but smote upon his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me a sinner. Whew. Now it sounds to me like that old boy understood being guilty and knowing it. And that's sort of the way I am. I'm amazed that God has anything to do with me. I'll be honest with you. Lord, help. It ain't a bit of use. Ain't a bit of use in me getting up every morning and telling him how good I am. For he already knows. And there ain't a bit of use in me telling him how much time I'm dedicating to study of his word. For he already knows. And there ain't no use in me telling him how much money I give, for he already knows. But he also knows a lot of other things too that I sure would not want to admit in front of all of y'all. But he already knows.
Yes, sir.
I'll tell you, Revelations 3 fits me to a T. And you'll remember this: wretched, miserable, poor, and blind and naked.
Right.
That's me. That's me. God knows that.
Yes, sir.
God knows every bit of that and more too. And he still daily loads me with benefits. What a blessing. I've said it before, I'd rather be a Christian than anything the world's got.
You're right there. You're right.
In that scripture, I'd rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than to dwell in tents of wickedness. Lord, goodness. All of us ought to be looking for something to do. Doing what we could. Titus 2 says, teaching us that denying ungodliness and worldly lust, we should live soberly and righteously and godly in this present world. Now remember, we're talking godly fear here. And the thought just come to me, Lord, help me not to be a camouflaged Christian.
There you go.
I know a little bit about camouflage. I've been trying to wear it for 50 years. And prior to that, when we was boys, we didn't have camouflage or nothing like that. So when we was trying to sneak up on anything or wait for it to walk by, we dressed in the dullest, drabbest things we had. And then when we got up a little older and camouflage come out, we tried to get us some so we could hide better. And that way stuff that we wanted to kill would come closer to us. Well, I'll tell you what. I am tired of being a camouflage Christian.
There you go. There you go.
For all that the Lord has done for me, the least I can do is stand out just a little.
There you go.
Now, I ain't nothing, never will be nothing, and it's a miracle the Lord don't strike me dead every morning. I'll be honest with you. And if you knew me as well as I knew me and the way God knows me, you'd agree. It's a miracle. But heaven help me not to be camouflaged in this world and let them think that I'm like them. Because I don't want to be. Ephesians says, submitting yourselves one to another in the fear of God. Lord help me. You company. Another reason I don't want to be a camouflage Christian is because your company defines you. I don't want to be out there in the worldly part. I don't want to take part in that because I don't want folk to think I'm like that no more.
Come on.
Your company defines you.
Yeah.
You can take a Christian and put him over there in a herd of sinners and he'll always turn into the sinner's lifestyle. He don't bring all of that crowd over with him. They taint him. He don't influence them. It works that way every time. And we all know people that have been at one point strong for the Lord and have backslid and went into the world. When they went into that lifestyle and associated with that lifestyle, it rubbed off on them every time. Every time. I don't know if y'all remember or not, but when Brother Glass was alive, he told this story. He said he was up at a preacher's meeting or something up north of here, and said they housed all those preachers in the basement of the church. And he said, wasn't no windows or nothing down there. And he said when they turned the lights out, he said it was black as night. And he said it's like ink. You couldn't see your hand before your face. And he said he had this little thing that I envisioned as a little pen light. Looked like a little pen, you know. And he said it didn't make enough light to see. But he said in total darkness, it's like a beak.
Yes, sir.
And he said he turned that little thing on. He said it seemed to light that whole place up down there. Well, the point was that as dark as it is in the world today, you don't need to have very much light to stand out.
There you go.
You don't have to be. You don't have to be a million candle spotlight. You got just a little bit of it. It's easy to see. You ain't the same as the rest of the crowd because it is total darkness out there. And you say, well, you might be hammering on that too much right there. We live in Calhoun, Georgia. It ain't nowhere near as dark out here as it is in Los Angeles and New York and all them places. This ain't nowhere near as bad as them places are. Oh, really? Me and Zach was mowing down in Calhoun, down there on Newtown Church Road, less than a mile from Newtown Church. And there's a big subdivision down there. Big old pretty monuments on both sides stating what the name is. And this sign right there is in front of both of them big signs. You see what that is? That's a picture of a church with a line drawn through it. And it says traffic down there. Translated, that means we don't want no church traffic in our subdivision.
There you go.
Well, I thought, heaven help us. I couldn't have possibly seen that right. This is Calhoun, Georgia. That can't be. So we turned around and went over there. And not only do they have that sign posted on the main road, both sides,
Yes, sir.
they is at least 50% of the houses in there got one in their own yard.
Yeah.
That's a disgrace. If I lived in that place, I'd make me a sign today. Church people welcome.
Come on.
I'd get out of there if I could. I told Zach, I said, let's get out of here before the Lord strikes this place with brimstone. I'd be scared to live there.
Satan is taking over.
I'd be absolutely afraid to live in that place.
There you go, Steve.
But
It's here.
there is a bunch of people that lives there. That place full of houses.
Yeah.
And at least 50% of them got that very sign in their yard. Like my grandmother said, we talked about last week, what a disgrace. Now that is a disgrace.
Right.
I lost my place, got so excited about showing them a picture, lost my place. Ecclesiastes 8 says, though a sinner do evil 100 times, and his days be prolonged. Now, get that part right there. Though a sinner do evil 100 times, and his days be prolonged. Yet surely I know that it shall be well with them that fear God,
Right.
which fear before him. Now, you ever wonder why folk live this any old ungodly way and seem to prosper beyond compare? You know, all of us falls victim to that from time to time. You know, we seem to be struggling, trying to do the best that we possibly can, and it's difficult. Life's hard, I know that. Especially if you raise a family and you got bills and all of these things, or maybe you don't, but it's still difficult. I mean, people struggle. Christians struggle. And then you look at these folks over there that never darken the doors, and they seem to have every possible material thing that the world offers, and they seem to just flourish and abound. But the Bible, warns us about thinking too much on them things, for we know the end.
Yes, sir.
And we know the fender mender, the fellow that takes care of us and promises us that if we'll live for him, we'll never have any want.
Right.
You remember, we read that verse. Look, I've heard enough bad news to last me for a lifetime.
Yes, sir.
I have. Me and Bob, we aggravate each other, And I'll walk up to him and I say, Bob, how are you doing? But now I ain't got 5 minutes. And if you're not careful, he says the same thing to me, and we're just kidding. But the first thing that'll come out of your mouth is, Lord, it's been rough today. I've had an awful time. I mean, it's all the bills is all due, and the roof's leaking on the house. My dog's sick. My wife won't pay no attention to me. It's awful at my house. I'm telling you, it's terrible. And that's what you normally hear now. That's so. I mean, you ask most folk, it just can't get much worse for me than it is now. I'm telling you, it's terrible. Well, you know, we're all salesmen for God. You know, we're supposed to be the folk out there waving the flag about how great it is to be Christians. And I'm telling you, if all we tell folks is how hard it is and how miserable we are and how bad things are at our house, we ain't going to sell what we got to many of them. I'll tell you that. They've got a better deal where they are.
There you go, Steve.
Yeah, why would they want to trade what they got? I mean, they're doing fine. Got a boat and a motorcycle and all that kind of stuff. And life's good for them. How in the world are we ever going to bring them over to where we are? Well, we ain't, unless we watch how we deal with people and what comes out of our mouth when we're trying to live a Christian life. Case in point, this just happened to me last week. Me and Brother Stanley, we go on to each other all the time. Lord, I'll say stuff to him, he'll say stuff to me, and we both know that we're just kidding. So anyway, he called me the other day, and Mrs. Stanley had got her new rifle, and he was going to show it to me. And anyway, I wasn't there. I was in the garden when he went by and didn't answer the phone. But anyway, long story short, he went on down the road, and I called him, and I said, I understand you stopped by. Yeah, I come by to show you the rifle. And anyway, we got to talking about the gun and all that kind of stuff, and I was aggravating him. I was just joking with him. But in my mind, what I meant to say was, Mrs. Stanley has immaculate taste in guns and men. Now that's what I meant to say. That's what's in my head. But when it came out my mouth, you know what I said? I said, Miss Stanley's got great taste in guns, but boy, she missed it when it come to men. Now that's what I said. And it was in my mind, and when it came out my mouth, it was a sight different than what I intended to say. So I didn't even think nothing about it. Well, I had to go to dump. Well, on my way up the road, it just sort of occurred to me, do you know what you said to him? And that got to bothering me. So as soon as I got back from the dump, I called him. And I said, now, preacher, I didn't mean to say that. You'll never believe that. And no matter, you can't unsay it. But I'm telling you, I didn't mean to say that. This is what I meant to say, that Mrs. Stanley has great taste in guns and men. Well, that's sort of comical, but you understand what we say and how we do and how we portray ourselves as Christians to the folk out here in the world will have a great deal to do with whether or not they're interested in what we have as Christians.
Yes, sir.
I'll be honest with you, and in all seriousness. Now, hope I never do get to this point, and trust God to take care of me. But if I was in need, I'd do my best not to tell you. I'd do my best not to tell you. Because what I do when I say that is that God has abandoned His promises and He is not taking care of me. Now, is that not what you would understand? If I said I was in need of whatever these things, and I know, now, take me reverently here, there are things, there's sicknesses, and there's desperate circumstances that call for help from the brethren in the church. And that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the daily necessities there. I do my best not to tell you, because in doing so, I cast doubt and shame on the promises of God, because He has promised us that if we'd live for Him, we'd have no want. He would take care of us every day. Well, the Lord dealt with that very subject Himself in Psalms chapter 50. This is what God said. He said, I will take no bullock out of thy house, nor he-goats out of thy fold. For every beast of the forest is mine, and the cattle upon 1,000 hills. Verse 11 says, I know all the fowls of the mountains, and the wild beasts of the field are mine. And then in verse 12 he says, if I was hungry, I would not tell thee. For the world is mine, and the fullness thereof. As Miss Betty says, heaven help us all.
Yep.
The last thing we need to do is be on Facebook and Twits or Us complaining about how bad it is to be a Christian. Now, what we need to be saying, if we're on them things, if you are, that's fine. But what I'm saying is, when you're saying stuff on that mess, what you need to be saying is, boy, what a beautiful day it is.
Yes, sir.
And boy, the Lord sure has been good to me today.
Amen.
And
Amen.
the Lord delivered me out of such and such and such last week and blessed me abundantly.
Yep.
And I can't help but glorify Him today.
Amen.
Now that's what we need to be saying.
Amen.
I sold stuff for a living for a lot of years all over the country in Mexico and Canada. And I'm telling you, I know a little bit about selling stuff to folk. And if I went in there and said, look, now this stuff right here, it's basically junk. You know, you're going to try to use it to make these things, but it ain't going to work. And when you make them out of it, just as soon as you try to use it, the bottom's going to fall out of it. And so I'm trying my best to sell it to, and I want you to buy it. But I'm telling you, if you get it, you ain't going to like it. Now, I'd starved to death as a salesman trying to do that. No. What I did was I said, looky here. I know what these other folk got, and I'm telling you, I know what this stuff is, and mine's better than theirs. And I'm telling you, my price is cheaper than theirs is too. Not only did I give you a better value, but it's lower cost. And then at the other end, I'm going to take care of you. Anything you need, 24/7, you call me. Here's my personal number. If you need anything, you call me directly. I'll take care of it. Now that's what I said when I went out there, and by the Lord's mercies, made a living for a lot of years selling stuff. If you don't think it's the greatest thing in the world, you can't portray to others that it's worth having.
Right. Right.
But if others hear you from the heart, explain to them how great it is to be oh Lord, where did you come from? But anyway, if others hears you, and I'm quitting, but if others hears you, and what you have is the best there is, and you're the best there is at representing it, and they're going to be satisfied with it forever, and nowhere else can they get something as good as what you've got. You can't keep inventory in the house.
There you go.
Now, this is just a couple of the things that we need to bold on as new Christians, and what we termed as aftermarket parts. But take anything away from the lessons right here is that there's tremendous promises to Christians. And if we get in this Bible here and look for them, you'll find a promise that'll accommodate you and satisfy you and nurture you through the storms of life. And if we'll bold on this aftermarket part of godly fear, it'll cause us to deal with Him reverently, righteously, with holiness, to where we can enjoy all of these blessings that He's outlined in Psalms chapter 34 for us. Thank you for listening.